Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the webinar UIA's International Animal Agriculture Roundtable covering the countries of Scotland, Vietnam, and Belgium. I'm your moderator today, Jamie McLaughlin. I am the VP of the UIA Animal Law Commission Working Group, and this is part of a series. If there are countries that you're interested in hearing about, please reach out to us. So today's program will consist of 3 panelists, and it will be followed by a roundtable discussion between the panelists and myself. Unfortunately, we're not going to be taking audience questions today, but the presenters will have their contact information listed. So if you want to reach out to them about something, you can after the fact, or you could reach out to us here at the UIA. So to start today, we have our first speaker, Charlotte Edgar. Charlotte is a dispute resolution solicitor qualified in Scotland and England and Wales. She holds an LL.M, that's a legal master's degree, in animal law from Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. Her areas of interest include UK and international farmed animal welfare and strategic litigation to mitigate the harms of industrial animal agriculture. Charlotte's a trustee of the Scottish animal welfare charity OneKind and is a member of the UK Centre for Animal Law's Scotland Committee. Thank you and welcome, Charlotte. You can start your presentation.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here today. Just going to share my screen and then we can kick off. Okay, so you can see my screen all right?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Jamie. So just to briefly outline what I'm going to be speaking about today, I'm going to be covering Scottish and UK animal welfare law, specifically in relation to farmed animals. And I thought that I would start by a brief scene-setting introduction about Scottish and UK jurisdiction, and then highlight some Scottish and English animal welfare laws. We're also going to have a look at some hot topics in brief. These are news items that I have seen recently that I think would be helpful to discuss in some more detail. Okay, so as we have an international audience today, I wanted to just quickly outline the state of the political and constitutional makeup of the UK as it relates to our legal systems. So the UK is essentially a multi-nation state with England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland making up the countries of the UK. You'll be familiar with the Westminster Parliament in London, which makes law for the whole of the UK on occasion, and also England and Wales. A key facet of the constitutional makeup of the UK is that the devolved governments are able to make laws specifically for their own countries. So looking specifically at Scotland, we have the Scottish Parliament, which has powers to make laws in certain devolved matters which are within their own legislative competence. Significantly, animal health and welfare policy is a devolved matter for Scotland. Reserved matters are those areas of law which are reserved explicitly for the UK Parliament to legislate on. And some examples are the veterinary profession, animal testing, international negotiations such as trade law, and also some aspects of consumer law. I've also mentioned there the Welsh Senate, which makes laws for Wales, and the Northern Ireland Assembly as well. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour of the makeup of the UK, in case anyone listening today is not so familiar with that. Okay, so now we're going to look briefly at a bit of context for the UK farmed animal welfare system that we have. So in the UK, there are approximately 1.2 billion land animals which are slaughtered for consumption annually. And of those, the largest majority is chickens at around 1 billion. If you want to include aquatic animals within that number, as we know, it is quite difficult to get statistics on this, but roughly I've seen numbers between, say, 4 billion up to 6.4 billion if they are included. So the numbers are much larger. Another trend that we are seeing in the UK is the growth of intensive farming. So there are around 1,600 intensive large farms in the UK, and of those, around 800 could be considered a CAFO, i.e. a concentrated animal feeding operation. Now, they wouldn't fit the definition of CAFO in the US, but it's essentially the idea that about 800 are the biggest and largest farms that we have in the UK. In Scotland, there are at least 65 of these very large farms, although it is quite difficult to get reliable data on the numbers. Overall, there are about 16 million animals in factory farms in the UK, according to the Compassion in World Farming statistic. And in total, around 73% of UK farmed animals are kept in factory farms. We also have a growth of no grazing systems for dairy cows in the UK. Now, I've mentioned EU law on the slide there. That is one of the key points to be aware of when you're looking at the UK and its farmed animal welfare laws, because approximately the RSPCA estimates there are around 80% of our laws which in the UK which are based on EU law in relation to farmed animal welfare. So this means that a lot of the criticisms which we can make about EU law also apply in the context of the UK. The other point on the slide to mention is Brexit. The UK left the EU on 31st of December 2020, and that makes our legal system and picture a bit more complicated. Essentially, all of the main animal welfare laws were retained after Brexit, but there still remains a question mark over the extent to which the UK is going to follow EU farmed animal welfare policy in future, or whether it may diverge from it. And we have seen some examples of that, which I'll point out later during the presentation. The last thing to mention is that the UK did enact the Animal Sentence Act 2022, which essentially transposed a similar legal acknowledgement as the Article 13 of the TFEU for the EU. Okay, so on this next slide, I have listed out some of the key items of Scottish legislation which apply to farmed animals. Now, this is just a selection. It's not necessarily comprehensive, but these are what I think are the key ones. So firstly, we have the Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act 2006. This imposes duties to meet animals' needs and prevent unnecessary suffering. Recently, the law was amended, and in Scotland, we have enhanced powers of authorities to seize and dispose of animals, which can apply to farmed animals in certain limited circumstances. As I've said and mentioned EU law, the key point, as you can see here, is that many of our regulations are based on directives or regulations originating from the EU. So we have the transport regulation from the EU, which was transposed into the 2006 transport regulations in Scotland. One of the key ones on the slide, which I've highlighted in bold, is the Welfare of Farmed Animals Scotland Regulations 2010. And as you'll see, this transposes the minimum standards for the various types of farmed animals in the EU into Scots law. Though notably, these regulations from 2010 do not apply to fish. And lastly, we have the slaughter regulations from 2012. Now, one important note about the legislation in Scotland is that sometimes there are derogations from the EU law, sometimes there are additions according to any specific provisions that might go beyond EU law that are a feature of the national law of Scotland. But as this presentation today is not a detailed compare and contrast review, I'm not going to go into those specific information for the purposes of today. But hopefully this gives you an outline of the key legislation that applies to farmed animals in Scotland. Okay, so some snapshot here of the Scottish farmed animal welfare law that I thought would be interesting for us to discuss. So there are various Scottish Government codes and guidance which have been issued to promote good standards of the husbandry of farmed animals. We have codes relating to cattle, broilers or meat chickens, game birds, hens, pigs, and sheep. These codes are non-binding and don't have legal effect, but at the same time, they do have some evidential value when assessing whether or not a company has complied with the standards. Another point I wanted to mention is CCTV in slaughterhouses. We have regulations mandating CCTV throughout Scotland in our slaughterhouses, and this was introduced in the last few years. I believe it is based on an EU requirement, but there was a lot of campaigning at the time to ensure that this law was passed. We also have, as a recent and interesting development, some discussion in the Scottish Government about banning certain cages for farmed animals. Specifically, they've discussed enriched cages, and those are cages for hens which have perch and nesting material and litter. They're not much of an improvement on battery cages because there are still welfare impacts to hens, usually around the amount of space that they have and their abilities to express natural behaviour. So the Scottish Government has recently consulted on banning enriched cages. It is estimated that there are 1 to 2 million hens in Scotland which live in these kinds of cages. So we're hopeful that the government is going to ban enriched cages in future. The government did also say that they were going to look at farrowing crates. However, there hasn't been a consultation on this as yet, so charities are continuing to campaign for this to be on the government agenda. Approximately 60% of sows in the UK are housed in farrowing crates. And farrowing crates are those confining crates which sows are put into shortly before birth and up until the end of weaning of their piglets. Lastly, I wanted to mention salmon farming, as this is a significant area for Scottish farmed animal welfare law. And I'm just going to go on to the hot topic next, which covers this in more detail. So, salmon farming. This is a very important area economically for Scotland and the UK because Scottish salmon is the UK's largest food export, and it was worth £578 million in 2022. However, there are some significant welfare issues that can arise with salmon farming. For example, sea lice, disease, overcrowding, and problems in ensuring welfare at slaughter. Now, an area which has attracted attention in recent years is the mortality rates of Scottish salmon farming. For example, there were 17 million fish deaths in 2023. Now, the industry may argue that climate change or warmer waters are causing issues for the fish. But the reality is that in intensive farming systems with large numbers of animals in close contact with each other, unless diseases and their welfare is appropriately managed, there is going to be mortalities as a result of that. We know from recent press information that some of the fish inspectorates in Scotland are not too concerned about the mortality rates, as they see this as a natural consequence of the type of husbandry practices. Essentially, salmon farming in Scotland takes place in floating sea cages, which are usually placed in sea lochs, and they have large numbers of salmon confined to certain areas. Now, the environmental issues of salmon farming are well known, and a Scottish Government inquiry is currently ongoing into this issue at the moment. One recent example of the environmental issues is what happened last week. There was essentially an animal rights organisation which alleged that a fish disposal company had dumped a number of dead salmon on a Scottish beach. Now, in the past, the company was permitted to do this by the Scottish Government because they had issued a derogation from the usual waste disposal legislation. But this derogation ended on 31st of January this year. So it has been claimed that the company that processes the waste was carrying out this disposal in breach of those legal requirements. The company has said that they're in the process of installing a fish waste dryer to deal with the waste that they are processing. But this example, I think, highlights that there are significant concerns over the environmental impact of the industry, and particularly disposal of waste and the effect that that can have on local communities and the environment as well. Because there has been concern in the communities over chemicals and diseases entering the marine environment from a disposal of this nature. Okay, so now we're briefly going to look at some of the laws that are relevant in England and Wales. So again, it is similar to the slide I had for the Scottish legislation. In England, we have the Animal Welfare Act, which again has similar duties to meet animals' needs and prevent unnecessary suffering. We also have on the slide on the left the English equivalents of the relevant EU legislation for transport, farmed animals, and also welfare at time of killing. So importantly, to mention about this legislation is that the transport, farmed animals, and killing regulations apply to England only. The Animal Welfare Act applies in England and Wales, but there are also certain provisions that have some relevance to Scotland and Northern Ireland. So my one takeaway from this would be, if you're looking at farmed animal welfare legislation in the UK, to check the territorial extent of the legislation to work out where it applies, because some may be country specific rather than, say, UK wide, and you might have to look at different legislation to work out what the picture is. Briefly, some points I wanted to mention about England in the last few minutes that I have. So again, on the slide, I've talked about codes of practice. They have the same kind of status as they do in Scotland, although there are some additional codes of practice in England, such as farm deer, farm rabbits, goats, etc. CCTV, I've also mentioned. England has introduced similar regulations to Scotland. And if you want to learn a bit more about this, there are some interesting information online. There's a DEFRA government department analysis of the implementation of the CCTV, which concludes that it has had some effect on changing behaviour and it's a useful enforcement tool. The major advantage and recent change in UK farmed animal welfare law has been the live exports ban, which entered into force earlier this year. And this is a really significant step for animals because it bans the export of live animals for slaughter and fattening. Now, this covers cattle, horses, sheep, goats, and pigs. It does not apply to export for breeding and competition, which is still permitted. I've also noted on the slide there farrowing crates. We have done a bit better in England than in Scotland, because there have been some proposed bans in the last couple of years, although none of those have been successful. But conversely, there has not been any progress on a ban on enriched cages. I also wanted to briefly mention the carbon dioxide stunning of pigs, which is a UK-wide issue, as approximately 90% of pigs are stunned this way before being killed. And this is despite a Farmed Animal Welfare Commission report from 2003, which said that this type of stunning for pigs is unacceptable. So this is an area that is definitely ripe for reform. And I've mentioned the use of antibiotics and antimicrobials because the UK has also been criticised for not introducing stronger regulations in this area. Now, very briefly, in the last minute or so that I have of the presentation, I wanted to cover the second hot topic, which is assurance schemes. And specifically, I'm looking at the RSPCA Assured scheme. RSPCA Assured is a charity and wholly owned subsidiary of the RSPCA. They produce animal husbandry and welfare standards for companies which are higher than the minimum level of standards in the EU and UK law. The website says that they promote humane farming, transportation, marketing, and slaughter of farmed animals by implementing a set of rearing and handling standards. They also provide consumer information labelling on farmed animal products. These standards apply to approximately 4,000 farms in the UK that are part of the scheme. However, there has been recent negative press where there have been multiple complaints of poor welfare and bad practices and exposés by animal organisations. There's a concern that this is seen as welfare washing, and as such, the RSPCA is carrying out an investigation and review of the scheme currently. Recently, Sir Brian May, who was the Vice President of the RSPCA, resigned on account of the difficulties that he feels are being experienced in the scheme, and he had called for it to be ended. So he has questioned the RSPCA's conduct in that sense. This is a live issue that shines a light on these assurance schemes for consumers and the information that is provided to consumers. So watch the space to see what happens in future. Okay, so that comes to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening to me today. If you'd like to learn a bit more, there are some resources I've placed on the screen here. And if you have any questions or would like a copy of the resource list, then please do feel to contact me on LinkedIn. And thank you for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was wonderful. Our next speaker is Hang Lee. Hang is the Southeast Asia Regional Manager for Humane Society International's Farm Animal Welfare Program. Her career has focused on the welfare issues of livestock production from small to large-scale producers. At HSI, Hang works with all stakeholders, including producers, food businesses, financial institutions, and more, to promote farmed animal welfare for laying hens and sows, which are mother pigs, throughout the food supply chain. Welcome, Hang, and you may begin your presentation when you're ready.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Just go ahead and go to presentation mode. Perfect.
Okay, here we go. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Where are you based? Thank you for having me today. So as introduced, my name is Hang Lee, and I'm the Southeast Asia Manager for Farm Animal Welfare Department. So of Humane Society International. So for today's presentation, I will give you the overview of farm animal production in Vietnam. What are the main welfare concerns, and how the condition of Vietnam current law compared to international standard like World Animal Welfare Organization for Animal Health, and then what exercise focus and what we aimed for and what we will recommend. And finally, I'm going to share some of successful case studies which could be used to influence policymakers. And I just want to share that Vietnam is a developing country, and farm animal welfare is slightly new here. I would say just like 5 years ago and started something, but it's still very new. But the good thing is people here are very open-minded for the new ideas. And we are able to talk with policymakers, producers, and also food corporation investors to gather all the people together in the same room to work on farm animal welfare. So for some of you not familiar with Humane Society International, we are the non-profit organization, and our head office in Washington, D.C. And we have operated in South Africa, in Latin America, in EU, in the UK, and of course in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And we have a wildlife program. We have a companion animal research, engagement, animal protection and crisis response, animal using in research, and of course my farm team too. So I'm going to begin with giving you the overview of farm animal production in Vietnam. So in Vietnam, there are 4 main farm animal species now: buffalo, cattle for both dairy and meat, and pigs, and poultry for both meat and eggs. In my presentation, I'm going to share with you two main animal species now, pigs and poultry. The first reason is due to the welfare concern, and the second reason is that some alternative system that producers are using now in Vietnam, and how can help to influence the policymakers. So for the pig production, Vietnam is quite large. We are ranked sixth in the world for pig production, and you can see nearly 26.5 million pigs, not per year, but live pigs, and also so that will be equivalent of 3 sows. And the pig products account for the largest share of farm animal meat products in Vietnam in 2023. And the industry contribute nearly 26% to the GDP of Vietnam agriculture. So just to sum up, like the Vietnam pig production is very important. And then moving to the egg production, Vietnam has nearly 87 million hens, and it increasing due to the population growth and also the change in the diet. I'm going to share with you a little bit how the pig production in Vietnam is increasing. So given the economic importance of the pig production and also the increasing consumption in the country. So the government had supported the industry by implementing the strategies and the vision to enhance and protect the industry from the risk, especially the African swine fever. If you are not familiar with African swine fever, it is a disease outbreak, and that resulted in the loss of nearly half of Vietnam's pig production back to 2019. So since then, it has been the biggest threat to the industry. And there is I would say that there are vaccines available, but it's really not affected yet. So the government had the strategy and the vision to support the industry, but however, animal welfare is not included at all. And there are more and more large farms growing in Vietnam now. So that is really concerned. So what is the problem of the welfare of the sows and the equine hand? The first one is for the pigs. So the more the pigs are confined in vegetation and farrowing place, I'm sure you are familiar, but I just want to emphasize here, and they cannot even turn around. And the piglets are subjected to routine procedures such as castration, tail docking, teeth clipping without pain-relevant medication. And in Vietnam, transport over long distance may occur in vehicles not designed for moving animals, such as back to the motorbike or in the overcrowded truck back. And in the slaughterhouse, they may not have effective stunning. An animal may be sensible when their throat are cut. And as I mentioned, Vietnam pig production is impacted severely by African swine fever. And also, recently, they also experienced some flooding. And due to the emergency situation, the whole animal herds may be killed without using any humane methods yet. And the similar situation for the cage and kayak production. So for the cage, and they don't have a chain to walk on the grass. They cannot perform any natural behavior such as nesting, dust baiting, perching, and foraging. And due to lack of exercise, they may suffer real physical effects, including with bones. And in the industry, to simplify the measurement, day-old check will be after several days. The check will be big trimming, will be bad. So without any consultation from veterinarians. And similarly to pigs, there is not any guideline to pop up with emergency issues when things happens like avian influenza outbreak yet. And moving to transportation is very common in Vietnam. And if you travel to Vietnam, you may see that a motorbike and they have a big cage in the back with the animals. That is a very common in Vietnam, especially in the countryside. So I'm going to show you some of the example. Here's in Vietnam we have two laws now: law on animal husbandry and law on the veterinary medicine. Put the Vietnamese version here too, because in Vietnam now we don't have any official translation of the law yet. So to be consistent, I just put the Vietnamese version here too. So they also include the humane treatment for livestock on farms, on transport, on slaughterhouse, on scientific and other activities. However, there are not any guidelines to guide the industry to implement the law yet. So that is a problem. And the second law that I just mentioned is law on animal health. They also including humane treatment for animals too. And they required for individuals, for organizations to carry the activity to reduce pain, fear, treat for animal. However, like the last law, they don't have any technical guidelines to implement the law yet. So what exercise is doing when we are working with the government in Vietnam, we will have them to look at what their current law and what the international organization standard look like. And we can see it, what they are lacking out, and we can have them to incorporate some of animal welfare to the law. So if you are not familiar with World Animal Organization for Animal Health yet, so that is an international organization to set the veterinary guidelines for the member countries to follow the standard. So Vietnam is one of the members. And for the world, they have a very strong pig welfare chapter. So I'm going to scan the pig production law in Vietnam to see if there are any criteria in the law now meeting the requirement of World Organization for Animal Health. So the first two criteria that animal must be provided the sufficient of food and water and good biosecurity and practice. It's a good news now. The law already mentioned. However, they lack a provision of other important animal welfare requirements such as living space, stocking densities, or others that related to the prevention of abnormal behaviors in pig farming. And these elements are very essential components of international animal welfare standards. And similarly, like when for other important animal welfare issues, they are not included in the law yet. And in short, in current laws and the policy in Vietnam, they do not clear mention details guidelines on animal welfare for each species yet. And this is one of the directions that Humane Society International will work and collaborate with relevant partners to change the policy. I would say it's not in the next 2 years or next 5 years, but probably 10 years or more than that. So what I want to give you how the Vietnam legal system, because it's quite complex. So the first one is the National Assembly is the one who will issue the law, approve the law. And then the specialized ministry will issue the decreases and circulars to guide the implementation of the law. And these are the legal documents with a compulsory and enforceable nature. And all of these documents are issued at the national levels. And then there will be some official documents, letter, but they are not legal, but have to guide the lower level to implement the policy. And at the Humane Society International, we focus working with ministry level agency or agency directly under the ministry. And they are responsible for programs related to farm animal production. And currently, SSI is working with Department of Livestock Production and the National Agricultural Extension Center. And they are under Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. And for SSI that we focusing on the pig farming and the at-land hand. And you can see the numbers of the animal increasing, and also there are some alternative solutions that producer can use. So what we encourage the government will do in the not next year, in the future. Of course, we do not expect to do change soon, but there are several key elements that we aim to work with the Vietnamese government. And they don't necessarily to ban prestation grade, but they can implement the programs to encourage the producer to adopt better welfare practices. And we understand that human involvement is the most important factor when implementing animal welfare practice. And we can collaborate with them to develop such as guidelines, and they can offer training back to their producers, And also another concern that given the high risk of the avian swine fever in the country, and we recommend the policymakers in Vietnam establishing the guideline for human cooling during the outbreak. And we think that it is not really important for the animals, but also for the people who involved in such activity too. And we understand that it takes time, as I mentioned, to develop the guidelines and policy, but we want to create the change step by step. And we know that it takes decades to change the policy. So we also work with private sector, producer, buyers, and investor to help them to change their policy first and then to influence the industry. I'm going to show you 2 key examples of how we are working now in Vietnam. So the first one that we think that investor can influence policymakers too. So IFC's International Finance Corporation, a member of World Bank, and they invest in pig production in Vietnam. And BAF and Marvin are the 2 largest pig producers in Vietnam. And one of the requirements of investment from IFC is group housing, which is a high animal welfare for pig production. And the second case study that we work with producers and food corporation to set higher animal welfare product. And that is we are focusing on the cage-free as now. Back to 2021, when I joined SSI just 2 years, so there were not cage-free as available yet. But from there until now, there are a lot of producers are moving to the cage-free system. And they also earn the animal welfare certification too. And you can see the numbers from 6,000 hens in cage-free. And by this year, it's nearly 120,000 hens. And we are expecting to increase to 100,000 hens in cage-free by the end of next years. And another one that in Mondelez International, they have a global cage-free act policy. And we also work with them to support them to implement the policy too. And we believe that buyer demands, investor requirements, producer transition could, when they are large enough, they could have to influence the regulation. That will bring me the end of final session. Now I would like to summarize by some of the key takeaway message here. I would say that first, please, the Vietnam pig in production ranks at the 6th globally, and the number of animals is increasing, and the farm size become large and larger. And due to the economic contribution of the pig industries, government has programmed and block policy to support the industry. However, animal welfare is not included yet. And we all know that changing the regulation does not happen overnight, but at Humane Society International, we commit to support the industry, government to address the animal welfare, the animal confinement in Vietnam. Thank you. Back to you, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Hang. If you want to stop sharing your screen right now, we're going to go to gallery view so we can chat for just a moment. So Alice Concetto will be joining us in just a moment. But before she does, I want to take a moment to ask you guys a couple of questions. It's really sad to me, particularly to see how everything in other countries is developing to fit the models that we're using here in the United States for intensive agriculture of animals. It's spreading worldwide, essentially, based on everything that I'm learning from both of you today. Charlotte, I wanted to know what the political climate is like right now in the UK as far as animal welfare reform is concerned.
Yeah, good question. So I think we are in a bit of a wait and see period at the moment because we had recent elections for the UK government and we now have a Labour majority in power. So we'll have to see what they're going to introduce by way of farmed animal welfare laws and hopefully some reform. And what I will say, though, is that the Labour Party has recently been criticised for not including any mention of farmed animals in their manifesto for the election. So that is obviously very disappointing, and we're hoping that they are going to be considering climate, environment, animal welfare as important areas for their government. So it's still quite an early stage. In Scotland, we have our next elections in 2026, so we still have a little bit of time to go. But politically, the situation there is a little different, as I think Scotland tends to want to align with the EU a bit more because there is quite a majority of people and politicians in Scotland who would like to rejoin the EU. So I think certainly from the Scottish perspective, they may be paying a bit more close attention to what's happening in Europe with farmed animal welfare. So a bit of a mixed picture, and yeah, we'll have to wait and see what happens in the near future.
Yeah, I'm wondering if what's going to happen in the next couple of years or how we see things developing will, change once those 2026 elections take place. Following up on that, Hang, I had a question for you. Do you think that these types of strong animal welfare laws from the US that could be developed or the EU could influence any potential regulation that's going to be happening in the future in Vietnam?
I would say yes. Like Vietnam is quite open country, and we observe what happened in the other side of the world. And we have a very strong partnership with the US and the EU or even with the UK. But the problem is we need to raise the awareness of the government in Vietnam and to show them that how advanced of the farm animal welfare regulation in those countries is. And another one of the good way that SSI also working is we also brought the Vietnam delegates to the EUs, right? And they can discuss the animal welfare regulations and how they can take that as the lesson learned to improve the policies in the country. And we hopefully we can see that activity more often when we have a next election in the future.
Thank you for that. Charlotte, something that I was really struck by in your presentation was the mandatory use of CCTV in slaughterhouses. I can never imagine that happening in the United States. As we know, in the US, we have all of these different types of gag laws and preventative stuff from the industrial animal agriculture to stop animal movements from getting in and seeing what's going on there. I'm just wondering how that came to fruition, like how that actually happened to get CCTV into slaughterhouses and whether or not that has changed anything since it's been implemented.
Yeah, so I believe there was a big campaign both in Scotland and England by animal charities to have this introduced to really improve transparency in slaughterhouses, improve practices, and also help with better enforcement of our existing law. I think it's a challenging issue to talk about humane slaughter because some people would say there is no such thing, but I think generally the approach would be that all animals should be stunned before slaughter, rendered insensible to pain. Now, I think in Scotland, there is a limited amount of non-stun slaughter which takes place for religious reasons. And in the wider UK, there is also that practice as a derogation from the existing laws. But I also think that from reading into this a little bit, there's some statistics that suggest that some of the non-stun slaughter meat is actually exported from the UK, so we may be producing more than is actually required by our religious communities. So I think there's definitely room to have these discussions around non-stun slaughter and to promote, the most animal welfare friendly approach, which would be to stun animals before slaughter. So yeah, it's really good that we do have mandatory CCTV in place because it does hopefully improve enforcement of our laws. And as I mentioned, there is a DEFRA report online which looks at the implementation of the mandatory CCTV in England. So if you're interested, you can read into that in more detail because it looks at the aims of the legislation, whether or not those have been achieved, and generally there does seem to be a useful enforcement outcome because a lot of the CCTV can then be used to support enforcement issues with substandard practice and things like that. We need to have the evidence, compared to as you said in the US, it's really difficult to even get into the farms to know what's happening. So at least we have that option there that we can hopefully supervise it a bit more.
That's amazing. Yeah. So not right this second, because we're still chatting and stuff, but a little bit later in the program, maybe when Alice comes on, if you have access to that and could put it in the chat later for anybody that wants to take a look at it. Otherwise, if you can't do that right now, you can send it to me and I can put it in an email to folks that have been on today watching. So, hey, I have a question for you. So do you think that trade agreements would help change Vietnam farmed animal welfare policy?
I would say in the long term, yes. For example, now Vietnam had very strong trade agreements with the UK or the EU, and we do not export land farm animals, but we are exporting shrimp fish to those markets. And if there are strong policy there, right? And of course, producers in the country must comply with the law to be able to export in those countries.
Mhm.
And I would say that when the industry change and they are large enough, they can combine and they can influence the regulations in the country. And when the government is ready to move some of the animal species for fish and shrimp already, they may consider, to do for other animals too. And I hopefully at that time it's less challenging to do the policy advocacy work with them.
That's hopeful, at least. I mean, it's something that hopefully could be implemented in the future. And I see now that Alice has joined us. She's going to be our third speaker today. Thanks so much for joining us, Alice. So I'm going to take a pause right now to introduce Alice, and she's going to give us a presentation, and then we're going to have a few more questions following that. So to introduce Alice Concetto, she is the Executive Director and Chief Legal Advisor at the European Institute for Animal Law and Policy. She additionally is a lecturer in EU Animal Law and Ethics at Sciences Po, which is in Paris. She was previously a fellow in the Animal Law and Policy program at Harvard Law School from 2016 to 2018. Her publication record includes several law review articles in journals, and she is the author of the forthcoming book, EU Animal Law, from Edward Elgar Publishing. Alice earned a master's degree in animal law, that's an LL.M, in 2016 from Lewis and Clark Law School, for which she obtained a Fulbright grant. She graduated from Sciences Po Law School in Paris. Thank you for being with us today, Alice, and you can go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you everyone for bearing with me. Okay, so I'm hoping everyone can see my screen. So
great.
Is everything okay?
Right. Perfect. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, today I'll talk about farm animal protection laws in France and in the EU, and I'll explain, you'll understand why the EU comes into play in this presentation. So first I'll present the legal status of animals in French law, and then I'll dive into, the practical treatment that's afforded to farm animals in EU legislation, and we'll see in a minute that actually EU law is codified into French law. So first, to give you a bit of a historical background and general principles when it comes to animals in French law, French animal law, or let's say contemporary French animal law, started in 1850 with the enactment of a criminal provision that made it an offense to publicly and abusively abuse domestic animals, and that act was punished by a fine. What's interesting here is that you could abuse animals in a private space, so typically in a home, but if you were doing this in public, then you would be liable to pay a fine. And that really was the first provision in French law that talked about protecting animals, and in this specific instance in the context of criminal law. The next milestone of French animal law history was in 1992 with the reform of our French criminal law. So you'll see that I'll mention a lot of those codes. So I'll talk about the civil code, the criminal code. It's just the way in civil law countries to classify our legal texts. And in 1992, the French criminal code, the French criminal legislation, was reformed, and with it came the creation of a standalone chapter on anti-cruelty laws, when before anti-cruelty laws were classified as crimes against property. And with this new criminal legislation in 1992, you do have a chapter on crimes against property, or offenses against properties, and you now have, since 1992 in French law, a chapter dedicated to those offenses against animals. So there's nothing substantial here in terms of change. It's just that there's a change in the way we classify laws, and that change reflects the fact that we consider animals to be distinct from properties. Moving on to agricultural law, interestingly, in my opinion, French law, and more specifically French agricultural law, recognizes animals as sentient beings, so to speak. So the French language doesn't have that term of sentient beings. The French language talks about the fact that animals are able or capable of experimenting pain, which is roughly the same as, you know, recognizing an animal's sentience. But in 1976, the agricultural code, so French agricultural legislation, recognized, or I should say, the French legislature in the agricultural law recognized that animals are capable of experimenting pain, and as a result of this, prescribes that all animals must be placed by their owner in conditions that comply with the animal's species-specific biological needs. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but it just tells you, because animals are capable of experimenting pain, you should treat them in a way that doesn't hurt them, that doesn't harm them. And that happened in 1976, which is pretty early in the history of, you know, recognition of sentience in law, and especially in European law, if we take a comparative approach to this recognition of sentience. And interestingly, it happens in the context really of agricultural law. So here we're really talking about animals that are used for food production purposes. So it's quite novel. And then we have you know, some information on the legal status of animals in civil law, which is basically the equivalent of property law in common law jurisdictions. And since 2015 in French civil law, again, the legislature recognized the animal's the animal's ability to experience pain, which is again roughly the idea that animals are sentient beings. However, the legislature also says, well, you know, animals are still subject to the regime of property within the limitations contained in the laws that protect them. So animals are protected under certain law, but roughly speaking, animals should still be treated as properties. And this is quite recent. This is actually since 2015. So we have this very ambivalent language in the French Civil Code that says, on the one hand, animals are capable of experiencing pain, but on the other hand, you know, they are subject to the regime of property. So they're still regulated under property law. And this really reflects and resonates with a very, you know, a core principle of civil law jurisdictions, which is that division between persons and properties. I mean, I'm saying it's specific to civil law jurisdiction, but I realize as I'm saying this is also the case in common law jurisdictions. So really, in French civil law, there are only two possible status for entities. You're either a property or a person, and this is really what the French Civil Code is saying. Even with that amendment in 2015, it says basically animals are not persons. They're sentient beings, but, you know, nowhere does it say in French law that animals are persons or that they're not properties. So animals have this weird status as sentient beings. And then the French Civil Code is actually very specific in saying, well, not only are animals, you know, regulated under property law, but, and then you have some other provisions in the French Civil Codes that are very, very explicit in saying, well, animals can be immovable property, what's called immovable property by destination. So that's typically the case of cattle on fields. They can also be movable properties in some instances, and they can be movable properties and horses. So it's not very clear actually what that status is. So if you can be an animal that's a movable property, or you can be a horse. So it's actually quite confusing, but the general idea is that animals are definitely properties. And then comes this sort of, you know, qualification that, so animals are subject to the regime of property, but there are some, you know, this is as a general principle, except in very specific instances where the legislature has specified that some protection applies to animals, that some levels of protection apply to animals. So as you can see, it's actually very confusing, you know. I mean, the general idea is that animals are property under French law, but then there are all sorts of different specificities that depend on the specific context where the animals, you know, fit into the legislation. So you have countless, you know, articles, law review articles, really a large amount of literature on the legal status of animals in French law that basically, you know, detail all these different rules that I presented very quickly to you right now. But the legal status and the discussions around the legal status of animals don't really inform on the treatment that animals receive in the specific context of animal agriculture. If you want to have that information, you have to look at more specific rules. So you have to move from looking at the legal status of animals to those more specific rules on, you know, how to treat those animals, how to treat farmed animals, what's allowed and what's not allowed to do to them. And those rules are established in EU law and codified in French law by way of regulations. So I'm just giving you a little bit of a background on what the EU is. So the EU is sort of this international organization, but that really operates as a federal government. So just so you know, not all European countries are EU member states. So we have some European countries in Europe that are not member states of the EU. So that's the case of the UK, Switzerland, Norway. They are European countries, but they're not EU member states. But all EU member states are European countries. And the EU operates like a federal government, as a federal government in the sense that EU member states must follow and must implement EU legislation. So it's not your typical international law that maybe, you know, some member state ratify, don't ratify. All EU member states absolutely have to follow and implement EU legislation. And just again, for your information, because I'll use those words during this presentation, there are two types of EU laws that are directives and regulations. So just remember that those two words are synonymous with legislation. It's not, you know, you might think coming from another jurisdiction that directives are kind of guidelines like soft law instruments and that regulations are part of administrative law. That's not the case in EU law. Directives and regulations are laws. It is legislation. Okay, so now turning to those actual rules that apply to animals in the context of animal agriculture, I'm going to talk about EU farm animal welfare legislation, considering that in the case of France, France implements those rules established in EU law and doesn't actually go above and beyond what EU law provides. So they make a minimal application. So member states always have the option of going above and beyond what EU law provides. It's actually quite rare. Not many member states do so. And France is one of those typical member states that just simply codify EU legislation without necessarily enacting stricter measures than what EU law provides. Okay, so just as an introduction, something that's very particular to the EU is that all EU farm animal welfare legislation is actually taken as agricultural law as a legal basis. So the impetus behind animal welfare legislation in EU law is really the harmonization of production standards. It's not the protection of animals. The idea is that the EU legislature the role of the EU legislature is to make sure that all operators, all economic operators play by the same rules on the EU market. And that concerns also the ways in which animals are treated to the extent that that influences on the pricing and the production of agricultural goods. So, you know, the idea is really to protect fair competition. However, the EU legislature, in enacting those competition rules, did slightly improve animal protection standards. So it made use of that competence in making sure that all those different operators operate by the same rules, but in doing so, still impose that operators treat animals a little bit better than they used to before the EU existed. So I put here an excerpt of the CAPS directive that clearly says the idea is to reduce distortions in competition. There's a need to establish common minimum standards for the protection of rearing calves or calves for fattening in order to ensure rational development of production. And then, as a second thought, it is recognized scientifically that calves should benefit from an environment corresponding to their needs as a herd living species, etc. So this is something you really have to keep in mind in order not to be disappointed with what this legislation actually provides, because then again, the main goal is to ensure fair competition between operators. We have some case law saying exactly this, so confirming the idea that EU law, EU animal welfare laws are mostly here to provide for a leveled playing field between producers. But the court also recognizes that the law was also conceived with a view to ensuring better treatment for laying hens in this particular case. So this is the current legal framework. It's actually quite comprehensive, especially if you compare it with other jurisdictions around the world. So there's one first piece of legislation that covers all animals kept for farming purposes. So I specified here in this table, this covers all animals bred or kept for the production of food, wool, skin, fur, or other farming purposes, and including fish, reptiles, and amphibians. And then we have species-specific legislation for egg-laying hens, calves, pigs, and broiler chickens. And then two pieces of legislation, and those are regulations for the transport of animals that covers all live vertebrates, and one regulation on the slaughter of animals, so on the protection of animals at the time of killing, that also covers all vertebrate animals except reptiles and amphibians, and only certain rules apply to fish. Now, there are limitations to those laws, but again, this shouldn't come as a surprise, considering that the main goal of those laws is to really, ensure the level playing field between producers, as opposed to really advance the protection of animals. So a lot of this legislation actually codifies common agricultural practices, starting with extreme confinement, mutilations, brutal slaughter methods. So maybe to go against what's sometimes a misperception about the EU, the EU does allow the use of battery cages. They're called enriched battery cages, as opposed to conventional battery cages that you might find outside of the EU. And the difference is that they're slightly bigger than conventional battery cages, and they include some enrichments for egg-laying hens, such as scratchers, perches, but it's actually, I put those two images so that you realize that it's actually not a substantial development in terms of animal welfare. And 50% of egg-laying hens in the EU are still kept in those cages today, so it's quite a significant amount. There's also, EU law also allows the use of gestation and farrowing crates for pigs and for sows. And it allows all sorts of mutilations, so typically debeaking for poultry animals, tooth clipping and piglets, tail docking and piglets, all sorts of, common agricultural practices that I'm sure you're aware of, that also are occurring around the world. In terms of killing methods, EU law allows virtually all killing methods that the industry uses. So percussive blow to the head for piglets is 100% allowed under EU law. The grinding of chicks, of baby chicks, is also allowed in EU law. The use of carbon dioxide at high concentration for pigs, the use of electrical water bath in poultry, all of that is totally allowed and absolutely allowed. Even though the European Food Safety Authority, which is our agency that publishes scientific recommendations, has advised against the use of carbon dioxide for pigs and the use of water bath stunners because those methods of killing are actually generate a lot of suffering in animals. But the legislature was actually very transparent about it and saying that we realize that those methods are detrimental to the welfare of animals, but there is no economically viable alternatives to those methods at the moment, and so therefore those methods should be allowed. Okay, so considering all those limitations, the European Commission, which is the EU's executive branch, it's the equivalent of our government at EU level, announced in 2020 that it would revise farm animal welfare legislation and basically update all 7 pieces of legislation to make it more consistent with, best available science, and also taking into account the evolution of the industry, like the industry itself. I mean, the legislation is so, lacks so much in ambition that even the industry is voluntarily doing better. So the idea was for the European Commission to update that legislation, both in light of science, but also industry practices, industry good practices. Sadly, and I put a little timeline, I don't know how much of it will speak to you because it's full of EU jargon, but the consultation phase with the stakeholders, so, the industry, but also citizens, started in 2021. So the European Commission ran all sorts of impact assessments, also all sorts of public consultations to really anticipate the impact of the reforms that the European Commission had in mind then. But sadly, the process was blocked. So it's been blocked since last year, since 2023. And of all the new legislation we were supposed to have, or at least the new bills that we were supposed to see last year, only one was actually published, which was the legislative proposal for a revision of the transport regulation. I haven't actually talked about transport, but it's one of those also pieces of legislation that practically allows anything, including very long transport of animals, terrestrial transport, but also maritime transport. So we're hopeful that at least the transport regulation will be revised, but it's not clear whether the other pieces of legislation will be revised. So the European Commission actually published a new document a month or so ago announcing that that revision was going to go forward, but was going to be delayed, and that the revision process would start again in 2026. But it's actually not clear what the European Commission actually means. So we'll see in the next few months or years where that process will go, and hopefully animal advocates will manage to obtain this long-awaited revision. So that's it for me. Just a few takeaway messages. So in the EU, member states determine the legal status of animals, usually in their civil law, but the practical treatment of animals is established in EU law, which the member states codify by way of legislation or regulation. And even though the EU doesn't have competence, strictly speaking, in adopting legislation on animal protection, it has enacted a set of legislation that regulates the treatment of animals on farms. But there remains important gaps in the substance and the enforcement of the text. And for that reason, the EU committed to revise some of the farm animal welfare laws, but this revision process is blocked at the moment. And with that, thank you so much. Just so you know, we have a lot of resources on our website, including a very comprehensive report on farm animal welfare legislation in the EU. So please feel free to visit our website. And we also have a newsletter if you want to be updated about developments in the EU. And we also have a newsletter in French that really focuses on developments in EU animal law in France and French-speaking countries in Europe. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions or comments.
Thank you so much for that, Alice. We're going to go back to gallery view here so we can continue with our Q&A. That was wonderful. And especially, Alice, thank you for pointing out that you have the newsletter available in French. At the UIA, we like to have everything translated into French, Spanish, and English. so things are available
That's good
for
to
other
know.
folks, which I feel is kind of Eurocentric since we're not covering so many other countries, which we really need to do, but it's helpful. So thanks for putting that resource out there. So I wanted to kick off this part of the roundtable by asking Charlotte a question specifically about what's happening in the courts in the UK. Are they talking about farmed animal cases at all? Are these types of cases being brought there?
We haven't seen these types of cases in Scotland yet, but certainly there's been quite a lot of activity in England. I can give you some recent examples. So we've mentioned the General Farmed Animals Directive. Alice mentioned it in her presentation most recently. That has a provision on breeding procedures that says that no animal should be kept for farming purposes unless it can reasonably be expected on the basis of its genotype or phenotype, i.e. its genetics, that it can be kept without detrimental effect on its health or welfare. And so a UK charity, the Humane League, is focusing in on this issue in relation to meat chickens or broiler chickens. And they have brought a judicial review in the High Court of England and Wales, essentially on the basis that the way that broiler chickens are raised does not comply with the EU law because of the way they are bred to be very fast growing. Their genetics can cause lots of welfare issues for them, and so they're challenging the basis on which they are bred. So currently the status of the case is that it is going to the Court of Appeal. So we're keeping an eye out on that to see what happens in the near future. Another recent example is that Animal Equality is challenging by judicial review the planning decision to grant a on-land salmon farm, which is a type of intensive farm in England, on the basis that animal welfare was not sufficiently taken into account in the planning decision. So that's going to go to the High Court as well. So we'll look to see what happens in the outcome of that case. And generally speaking, there's been quite a lot of interest in pollution as a hot topic in the UK. Campaigners are understandably very motivated to raise it as an issue because it affects so many people, and particularly in areas where industrial farms are close to water sources. There's concerns about pollution, and people are looking for ways to try and challenge that. So there's certainly lots of activity going on, and I'm encouraged to see that farmed animals and issues directly affecting them are becoming more visible to the courts and to the public as well.
Yeah, I think that that's really important, especially the environmental impacts that you mentioned, because we need to expose what those impacts are when it comes to, especially that's so strange to think about fish farming that's not that's like on the land, has its whole other type of environmental impacts than fish farming in sea pens and stuff. All bad, of course, but something really important is that at least the environmental issues that are being exposed to the public and gaining more traction in the courts are exposing the problem that this is not just an animal welfare issue. So folks that are just focused on animal welfare, we get frustrated because we know that there are environmental impacts, there are social justice impacts when it comes to the people that are involved in these industries. And hopefully this additional exposure will, get more people on the animal welfare side, or just to let them know that these are not isolated problems, that they are intersectional issues. So moving on from that, I wanted to ask a question to Hang, and that is, when it comes to advocating for farmed animal welfare policy in Vietnam, what do you see as being the main challenges?
That is a very good question, Jamie. I would say that the first challenge is the awareness of the communities in Vietnam is not really like what you are guys in the EU or in the US yet. And Vietnam is also a developing country, so economy is still their priorities, and animal welfare, of course, behind, and they don't care much about animal welfare yet. And the second I want to mention is there are not much NGO effort in Vietnam yet. SSI is only one international organization working with the government on farm animal welfare in Vietnam. And the third thing that I also mentioned in my presentation is the risk of the African swine fever. So it makes hard for industry to change something, and it also made the government think that they need to protect the industry by having good biosecurity, by having good the controls, and support the country from the risk of the African swine fever. And I would say the fourth thing is that there is not much studies or results in Southeast Asia or even in Vietnam or Southeast Asia showing that animal welfare is a good system for the producer to move, and then I would say like when producers are moving and they are large enough and they see that it's a workable system and they government see it and they can adopt something for their policy. And the last thing is, I would say that is not only the problem in Vietnam, the issue in Vietnam, but also in other Southeast Asia countries too. Like the language barriers is one of the top challenges here. So Thai, we have a Thai language, Vietnamese, Malaysia have this different language too. So, and most of the document for farm animal welfare now are in English, right? And of course, producers don't speak English. The government, some of them speak English, but most of them don't speak English well. So that kind of like the gap, the knowledge gap, it could be a challenge too.
So thank you for highlighting that, because that's something that I wouldn't have known had you not mentioned it. We don't often hear a lot, we're very, like I said, centric of what's happening in European countries and in the US. And it sounds like this is really a call to action as far as getting some help with people being able to translate this information. And, I'm sure that when it comes to translation, there's probably lots of big ag companies that are working on that so that they can sell their wares in all of these countries that are just starting to adopt industrial animal agriculture. Sounds like we need to be on the forefront of that. And that's something it'd be great to talk with you more about offline to see if we could pull resources or get resources headed in that direction. Because it's really important, and we don't want to see other parts of the world turn into what we've done here in the US and in the EU. Alice, I have a question for you. You were talking a lot about terrestrial animal issues. What's going on with aquaculture and other species in the EU right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So they are covered under some of those statutes. So let me just share my screen real quick.
Sure.
So I can show you. So can you see it?
Not right now.
Let's see. Oh, here. So going back to my little table here. So aquatic animals that are vertebrates would be covered under some of the statutes. So the general directive that applies to all animals kept for farming purposes, they apply to fish, but not to, actually they apply to all animals used for farming purposes. So including fish, but also including, cephalopods, decapods. The issue with that statute is that it's so vague that it really doesn't mean anything. So, those are very aspirational wording, such as, well, you should give animals adequate protection, which, okay, what does it mean in practice? Nobody really knows. And of course, the industry has a way to interpret this kind of wording in the way that benefits them. It doesn't benefit animals. And then, so there is no species-specific legislation for aquatic animals. But they are, again, the vertebrate aquatic animals are covered in the under the transport regulation, but there's no specific standards that would apply to fish or, you know, cephalopods or decapods. So that's kind of not really covered. And I mean, it is covered on its face in the statutes, but if you look at the statute, you won't find anything that actually applies to those animals. And the same goes with the regulation, the slaughter regulation. So you know, vertebrate aquatic animals are covered, but there's no specific provisions that would apply to them. And actually the statute is very clear, only key principles of the regulation apply to fish, and that is only one. So the key principle that we're speaking about is about, you know, that death should be quick and painful. But again, it doesn't really tell you, you know, in terms of the standards and the rules that should apply. So the transport regulation is currently under revision, and the European Commission's proposal includes standards for aquatic animals on how to transport aquatic animals. There are some more or less specific standards, so hopefully that will go through the legislative process and we'll have more specific standards for the transport of aquatic animals. And that includes really all aquatic animals, fish, decapods, cephalopods. So hopefully at some point those standards will also be developed, you know, in those other pieces of legislation.
Yeah, thank you for that. In every single country that we're all working in right now, change is definitely needed. And I appreciate the fact that we're talking about Vietnam and stuff like that today, because where there isn't any law, figuring out what that's going to look like in the future is important. So Charlotte, what changes would you like to see happen in terms of farmed animal welfare in Scotland and the UK in the future?
I think there's probably two main things on my wish list. The first one would be greater enforcement of the existing laws that we have. We are fortunate in the UK that we have reasonable laws, you know, based on the European system. But one of the main issues is actually enforcing those laws. There's issues with funding in doing that, expertise, having enough staff to do inspections, and the issue as well is that there's quite a fragmented situation in the UK in terms of who's responsible for what enforcement. Is it food standards? Is it local authorities doing other types of inspections of premises? So yeah, I would like to see more enforcement as a key change. And secondly, I think generally we need to do a lot more at a governmental level to really encourage a just transition away from industrial animal agriculture into other forms of feeding our people. Which is why I'm quite encouraged to see that in the UK we are starting to move towards hopefully regulation of cultivated meat. There's more companies active in this space now. Hopefully we'll catch up with the likes of the US and other countries like Singapore and Israel who have already approved it from a regulatory basis, and they have the products on sale in some of these countries. So yeah, I'm hoping that will be part of the future to ultimately reduce the number of farmed animals that are in this system.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, when it comes to cultivated meat, there's so much controversy around it, and scalability and cost questions and availability and stuff like that. And, you know, just looking at changing the system, you know, we know that we have an epidemic of obesity and, you know, heart disease and diabetes and all of these things in the US and spreading around the world with the things that we've been eating. So yeah, we should just be moving away from this for so many reasons, and getting everybody on board is really important. So we've got maybe time for one more question. Alice, can you talk a little bit about the recognition of animal sentience in EU law? What does that mean for farmed animals?
Yeah, so it's a great question because yeah, the EU is one of those few jurisdictions in the world to have codified the recognition of animal sentience in its constitution. So it's not actually called the EU Constitution, but it's a constitutional treaty which acts as the Constitution of the EU. And so in a way, you know, it applies to all 27 member states. So even those member states that don't necessarily recognize animals as sentient beings in their national legislation actually do by way of, you know, EU law applying to those member states. And this provision is actually, so I have it here, so I'll just share it really quickly here. So it basically says, it's quite a, it's a bit of a long provision that says a lot of things, but it basically says that the union and the member state, because animals are sentient beings, should pay full regard to the welfare requirements of animals. And that includes really, you know, farmed animals. It's really all the animals, including those animals we use in agriculture and fisheries and transport. And so, you know, including farmed animals. And then there's this huge exemption about, you know, those provisions relating to religious rights, cultural traditions, and regional heritage. So typically, ritual slaughter doesn't, you know, member states that allow ritual slaughter can allow such a practice because this is a religious right, and the EU basically has no authority to regulate on anything that has to do with tradition or religion. But again, you know, it's a potentially powerful provision that hasn't really been activated. So it's one of those very aspirational provision, but we're still waiting for the effects of that provision for that provision to produce its full effect in legislation. So that's why the revision of farm animal welfare legislation was such good news, because from a legal perspective, this would have brought consistency between what we have in the constitutional treaty in terms of recognition of animal sentience and that duty of the union to make sure that, you know, animal welfare is given some sort of a significance in legislation and the legislation. It's not the case at the moment. We have this very positive provision in the constitutional law, and then you look at the legislation, it doesn't really translate. So again, we'll see. I'm hopeful that in the next few years, we'll obtain that revision of farm animal welfare legislation, and that will be good news also in terms of, you know, ensuring consistency in the legal text in EU law.
That's really exciting. Thank you for sharing that. So we are at time now. I'd really like to thank all of our experts for all the hard work you put into your presentations today. And we will be posting this recording online for everyone. Alice, please let me know if your companion, Kitty, who made an appearance today, needs us to sign the UI, sign any release forms before we post his or her images or their images on our YouTube page. But anyway, thank you so much, and we really appreciate it. Again, this is one of our series, and we will be back soon, maybe next quarter, with some other countries to cover here. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Take care, everyone.